everyone. Today we have another new episode, and this is very, very important because we are working with Transhumanist Party. Transhumanist Party, everybody know from Asia Pacific, they are one of the fastest growing political party with modern science, engineering, and technology, and they are doing fantastic work around the world in USA and other countries. So that's why we find most of the scientists from Asia Pacific, even though the youth community, they have keen interest about Transhumanist Party. So we have our honorable chairman, Mr. Kennedy, as well as Mr. David Schumacher. So we will discuss about Transhumanist Party, how they're working, what their strategy for the future, especially outside USA, how they want to work, how they want to collaborate, how more young talented people can join with Transhumanist movement. So I want to start from our honorable chairman, Mr. Kennedy. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Sharif. And once again, it is an honor to be speaking here at the World Talent Economy Forum. As you mentioned, my name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I'm the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party, and I've been the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party since November of 2016. Certainly, this has been quite an eventful tenure for me, especially since when I came into this role, I did not expect that I would need to lead the Transhumanist Party through a global pandemic, a pandemic that is still very much with us, but a pandemic that requires, in my view, a lot of the principles of transhumanism in order for the world to overcome. And it's interesting because last year, I would not have expected this, but it is the case now that the United States is one of the leading countries in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. This is so because the United States has been able to deploy its vast manufacturing capacity as well as its logistical network to distribute vaccines now to over 100 million Americans. And I myself am fully vaccinated against COVID-19. I have received the Moderna vaccine, both doses of it. And so I can now go out in public and essentially resume most of the activities of normal life. This is an outcome that I would want for the rest of the world, for as many people as possible in the Asia Pacific region. Unfortunately, the vaccine distribution capacity is still not at the level where we would want it to be. However, the next step in the fight against COVID-19 will need to be some sort of humanitarian initiative where the countries with abundant vaccine production capabilities will need to export the supplies of COVID-19 vaccines, which their own people might no longer have any need of, to other countries where the pandemic is still severe. And in the United States, it has been quite a battle, I would say, to get to this point, because not everybody wanted to go as quickly as we ended up going in terms of making vaccines available to the public. There is still, in my view, this pernicious precautionary principle that prevails in many regulatory agencies and many political movements, which essentially states that you have to be absolutely sure about any possible negative side effects. And if you even think there might be a risk of doing something in terms of technological innovation or deploying a medical treatment, then you don't do it. Of course, the consequence of that is that one falls victim to whatever dangers exist in the status quo, whatever risks and ailments and even likelihoods of death stem from complete inaction. So this is the mentality we've had to overcome in the United States. It's an ongoing challenge. But the Transhumanist Party supports a principle that differs greatly from the precautionary principle. It is called the proactionary principle. And the idea behind the proactionary principle is that one has to weigh the benefits and the risks, not just of a particular action, but also of not taking that action, of letting the status quo run its course. And it is very clear with the COVID-19 pandemic how the proactionary principle could have saved millions of lives, perhaps averted this pandemic altogether, given that the Moderna vaccine had been synthesized over the course of a weekend in January of 2020, shortly after the genetic sequence of the novel coronavirus was decoded. So imagine what would have happened if, in the few months thereafter, the production capabilities for that vaccine had been deployed, and then willing volunteers, we obviously don't want to force anyone to get vaccinated, but willing volunteers who would have been informed of the risks, but also the potential benefits, could have had the opportunity to get vaccinated then. Surely most of the lives that have been lost from this terrible, tragic pandemic could have been averted. So unfortunately, we can't go back in time and do what the Transhumanist Party had been urging governments to do all along. But from this point forward, I think we can adopt the proactionary principle more broadly. And this is what the Transhumanist Party will continue to advocate in developing countries. I hope that a lot of officials from various Asia Pacific countries will listen to this program. And I hope that they will understand these vaccines are saving lives. They are enabling people to get back to pretty much their normal routines and their opportunities that they had prior to the pandemic. And if you could have that in the Asia Pacific region, it would be a wonderful boost to your economy, to the quality of life of your people, and of course to public health and safety, which are the most important. But you have to engage in proactive measures and embrace these vaccination efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. David Schumacher, what the new strategy you have in hand specifically for this vaccine issues? Even though in the COVID-19 situations, many developing nations still they have a lot of problem with this vaccine. They have really they have problems. So how we can solve this problem? How exactly the Transhumanist Party can work on that for helping this developing nation? Is there anything?
Yeah, hi Sharif. Good to be back on with you, and thank you for the short introduction. As many of you know, because I'm on this program a fair bit, I'm Director of Applied Innovation for the United States Transhumanist Party, and I'm also the chair for Arizona. So, as a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons I wore this shirt today. This is my futurist cowboy shirt. Because I want to be able to tie both what's traditional in the West, where I live, to the U.S. and be able to tie that up to the world. And that goes along with the other comments that I have today. As you already know, I'm very passionate yet rational about what we can do for my home state here, the country, and the world, specifically when it comes to transforming the human condition. When I talk about transforming the human condition, I'm talking about developing and making widely available, and I think this goes to your point, making widely available these technologies that can enhance longevity, and COVID is a good example of that. We are fortunate that the companies that, not all, but the majority of the companies that were working on the vaccines were here in the U.S. and even during that time a year ago, still had government support to get that done. And as we know, Gennady has talked about being fully vaccinated himself. I too am fully vaccinated, and so is Susan, my partner. And we have returned to some degree of normalcy. We have pushed in this country and in my state for maximum voluntary vaccination. And I think we are coming to a point where we're not at the saturation point yet, but we're coming to a saturation point where all those who want to get vaccinated will have been vaccinated, with the exception of maybe some that have age restrictions for children, or maybe people that have certain medical conditions. And we can now start pushing this vaccine out into other parts of the world. Sure, we would like to have had it faster. I will echo what Gennady talks about when he draws a delineation between precautionary and the precautionary principle. But you also have an advantage now that America has been a testing ground, if you will, for the vaccines that are out there. And hopefully that will help adoption in other countries as we can push these to Malaysia and Bangladesh and India and other places that desperately need this. It's more than just a technological challenge. It's also a psychological challenge and an emotional challenge. So that's why I talk about being passionate about this as well as being rational. I believe that we need both sides of those to get the complete job done. And that's true in transhumanism. I think we understand that very well. And hopefully we can help the rest of the world understand this as we go. Now, having said that, I talked about Arizona coming into this. Arizona lags the national average as far as vaccines is concerned. In the West, there is this very strong, rugged, individualist, freedom-loving independence streak, which isn't necessarily bad, but it can really slow the adoption of things that are new. It can be really hard for change to occur. So we're hoping that we can take what we've shown nationwide and be able to distribute that internationally and be able to, say, in Malaysia, maybe make a bigger dent in vaccinations than otherwise would have been made because of our track record. And then Malaysia can show the way to those that have been vaccine resistant in other parts of the world, like Arizona, and perhaps then follow your lead. So I think there's a lot that can be said about this. So those are my introductory comments.
Thank you. Mr. Gennady, one of the important things right now that every country has economical challenges. Many people become unemployed, and Transhumanist Party actually one of the advanced political party, those who are advocating for modern science, modern engineering, modern technology. That's why youth community has a very big hope on Transhumanist Party. Even personally, I try to get some good feedback from the different universities in Malaysia. I find that very good positive feedback. So as the youth community is basically thinking about Transhumanist Party, so how you can advocate for them, because of they need more employment opportunities, they need to survive. I just want to add one point. In COVID-19 situations, only in South Asia, they lost $1 trillion in education industries because of maybe lack of modern technology, lack of other things. 70% of the students from, let's say in Malaysia, they drop out right now. We have 105 universities. So things are not like good like USA, something different, something challenging. What kind of advocacy you want to do for these youth communities?
Yes, thank you, Sharif. And these are extremely important issues, particularly because of the tragic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on both employment and education, as you have described. Now, what we have learned in the Western world is that certain jobs are more resilient to pandemics. And those are the kinds of jobs that can continue despite restrictions on the locations where those jobs can be performed. So these are essentially knowledge work. Knowledge work can be done from any location, provided that one has adequate access to technology. In the United States and in many other Western European countries, and in some parts of the Asia-Pacific region as well, people who were knowledge workers could shift to working from home, and they could continue with the vast majority of their projects essentially without that much disruption. On the other hand, a lot of people who were, let's say, unskilled laborers or service industry workers, or people who had to be in some particular physical location, especially an indoor location, unfortunately, lost their jobs. So what this speaks to is the need to deploy a reliable technological infrastructure to enable more people to do their work from any location in the event of any sort of cataclysm that disrupts their ability to go to a particular place of work. So that means reliable internet connectivity. That means access to electronic devices, computers, mobile phones, and video cameras, reliable equipment that people can use, as well as technological literacy, the ability to use all of these tools, the ability to communicate, the ability to think systematically, the ability to analyze information, to think critically, to form one's own conclusions from the data rather than just following a prescribed routine. Now, all of these are higher order skills, but they're very much encouraged by the philosophy of transhumanism and the approach that the transhumanists take toward the world. So in the mind of a transhumanist, there's no fixed boundary for human potential. Human potential is unlimited, but of course, at any given point, we're not all powerful. We have to strive to improve ourselves. We have to educate ourselves. We have to always look for these areas of our lives, of our knowledge, of our skill set that can be improved. So we need to always go out and seek out information about emerging developments in science and technology, about world events, about the scientific method, about the rational way of thinking, and deploy them. And the answers to how to deploy them will differ for every individual because each person is in a different environment. So some of us already have access to better technological infrastructure than others. But just because you may be in a country where the internet access is a little bit slower, or perhaps you only have access to an older model computer or an older model phone, or even maybe you don't even have access to a computer yet, a computer in your public library, or you might have some textbooks, maybe textbooks that were written some time ago, a few decades ago. All of that can still be utilized to great effect. Just look at the opportunities around you, wherever you are, and ask yourself the question, how can this improve what I'm able to do, what I'm able to learn, and how I'm able to transform my life? That is essentially the transhumanist outlook toward the world. And it will get you to an incrementally better place. Now, I would also say to any person watching this, of course, it takes time for significant improvements to occur. There's no so-called magic bullet that will automatically get you wealth and prosperity and solve all of your problems. So one has to combine hard work and willpower with wise utilization of the opportunities and the technologies that are available to oneself. But over time, that makes an appreciable difference. And also, it's important not to compare oneself to other people in other circumstances who may have started out in a very different place. It's important, I think, only to compare oneself with one's own situation previously and how far one has come using the opportunities that were realistically available.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Honorable Chairman. Mr. David, here in Asia Pacific, there is 40% population around the world. They live in Asia Pacific. I think billions and billion people in Asia Pacific, they live. And youth has challenges. Mr. Kennedy actually guide them. They said that for improvement, yes, Singapore doing fantastic work, China also doing some good work, but we need better collaborations with the first world, with the developed worlds for modern science, engineering, and technology. How we can do this? What will be the futures of this Asia Pacific? What do you think?
Well, I really wish I had the answer to that, but let me tell you what I think about that. as I look into my crystal ball, I think I see a lot of opportunity for Asia Pacific because if I remember my demographics quite right, you have a huge youth population. And that youth population has curiosity as a major component of that age, something that as more of the Western societies have grown older in their years on average, I think they've lost some of that. So I think Malaysia actually, and the whole of Asia Pacific actually has an advantage in that. One of the ways that they can use that advantage is by pursuing things that I've talked about on this show before. Traditionally, people want to go and get a 4-year education someplace and then maybe an advanced degree of some type and maybe then work in some specialized area. Tell you the truth, I think that's more a sign of the past than a sign of the future. So people that are on the course that they've always been on in the US and maybe in the European Union and all of Europe, that seems to tend to still be the direction that they want to go. But in places like Malaysia, you have a country that is investing in infrastructure. You have the youth community. What the connecting factor that I think that's needed is access to what I'm seeing cropping up, which are micro degrees, certifications done by commercial enterprises. I'm promoting that here in the US to those that will listen, but I think there'll probably be more people that will listen to that in your home country. And I think that will actually position you to be able to leap ahead of the Western traditional ideas that tend to be a little bit sleepy. I think you have the advantage. And I think thinking about having the advantage is an advantage in itself because you can lean forward into that and really take advantage of that. So it requires using the infrastructure that's there. It requires the infrastructure investment that your government is doing. It takes time, as Donati has pointed out, but it also takes, I think, this targeted focus. So I would say micro degrees, those certifications that you can get from industry, but also I would also encourage people that if they don't have the means to be able to do that at this point, then look for opportunities to become involved in the type of technology and in the type of industry and decision making that they want to be a part of. And if they need to, work a job and then volunteer some time in that other area that they want to build some expertise in. I've seen young people here in the US do that to where that they could start to get a foothold into a career that would not have been available to them any other way. So I can't tell you how it's going to play out, but I can tell you that I am excited that we have a bright future and plenty of opportunity for Malaysia and the rest of the countries in that area.
Thank you. Thank you. Honorable Chairman, actually, World Talent Economy Forum, when we started, even though we have 12 years of time with our own groundwork, we develop our some good organization, but still we need a lot of improvement. So I just share my personal experience when I visit, I get chance to University of Cambridge. That time I saw that Singapore has very good strategy. Singapore, their government regularly, they send 2,000 students to Ivy Leagues and all of the top university. When they finish their study, then they come back to Singapore and they contribute for their countries. This is one of the very good strategy for development. We have to learn from the top university. So World Talent Economy Forum, we are working on our own universities. We want to develop university in developing countries, and the investment and other thing we ensure, but we need more scientists, more researchers, more philosopher from Transhumanist Party. How we get some sort of support from Transhumanist Party for running a high quality university. and we want to ensure these universities, those who study under our university and our academy, 100% will be employed in that top corporations. So how we can get good collaborations from Transhumanist Party?
Well, I think you already have a decent sampling of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and members with a variety of skill sets on your program. And of course, your program airs episodes quite frequently. So I would encourage those who are interested in outlooks from the Transhumanist Party to watch the many episodes that you have already recorded, Sharif. And of course, it is a continually growing endeavor. So hopefully we will offer more of our members as panelists for your future programs. And the Transhumanist Party is comprised of people with a variety of domains of expertise, from philosophers to scientists to engineers to developers of artificial intelligence to political activists and even artists. So there are many subject areas to draw upon. Now, I would say it's also important to consider, as David pointed out, that in many situations, the standard historical career paths that people in prior generations had come to expect are no longer going to be viable for people today, but there may be other opportunities. And this is a lesson that people in my own generation had to learn in a rather difficult way, because when people of my generation were growing up, we had been articulated expectations about our futures that generally did not quite work out to be that way. The expectation was, if you just go to school, if you get good grades, if you get into a good college or university, then after you graduate, you're essentially guaranteed a good, stable job that will support you financially for the rest of your life. There were many issues with that mindset, such that the reality failed to match those expectations. First of all, in the Western world, there was a major economic crisis, the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, which essentially meant that the supply of jobs considerably diminished just as many people were graduating. Many people who followed that path, unfortunately, were not too selective about what degrees they pursued, and they were not too selective about the expense of those degrees. So they took on an unsustainable amount of debt, and the job market was not there to give them the income streams that were needed in order to pay off that debt. At the same time, home prices escalated to such an extent that right now housing in the United States especially, but in other countries in the Western world, is essentially unaffordable even to people of upper middle class incomes, which is a great tragedy and a great crisis. That crisis began to manifest itself already when people of my generation were studying in colleges and universities, because we had a housing bubble in about 2004 to 2007 that was a precursor to the much larger housing scarcity issues that we are experiencing right now. And all throughout this, some of us have been able to make our own paths. And this is, I would say, not primarily the result of getting college degrees in particular fields. It is more the result of what we did after college. Because I remember doing an extensive job search throughout the United States as I was about to graduate from college. And I had 3 degrees. I had degrees in economics, mathematics, and German. And I was also taking actuarial exams in the meantime. I had passed 4 actuarial exams prior to graduating college. And the actuarial exams are some of the most difficult examinations in the world. Only about 40% of the people who attempt a given exam sitting will pass it. So even despite all of this, it took me a long time to find a job. Fortunately, I was able to find one right before I graduated, and I had to move 2,200 miles across the country in order to take that job. And I was really glad that I was undertaking self-study in addition to my college degrees, because that self-study, passing those actuarial examinations on my own time, was what enabled me to qualify for that job right away. So what I would encourage the young viewers of this program, as well as any viewers who are seeking a career change, to consider is that very often jobs will have very specific qualification requirements that don't so much depend on what degree you have, and especially they don't depend on how much money you spend to attain your education, but they will depend on getting certain very specific qualifications that may be required for that job, certain specific skill sets, or as David mentioned, certifications or micro degrees. Sometimes those could be used to demonstrate to a prospective employer that you have those exact skill sets that the employer would want. Because very often, even though every job is different and you actually learn more on the job than you ever could preparing for the job with regard to how to do that particular job. But a lot of employers will also want to hire people whom they don't have to take through all of the basic aspects of that job. And this is where younger entrants into the labor market have some difficulties, because they have to compete with everybody else who might potentially be seeking that position. So if you can demonstrate to a potential employer that very quickly upon being hired and upon just being familiar with the company or other organization that you work for, you would be able to start contributing in a significant way, then your chances would be greatly improved. But I would also say, this is most important, do not rely on your college or university education to remain sufficient for you as you continue in your working life. Even 5 years, but especially 10 years after you get your first job out of college, very few people will care about what college degree you have or what grades you received in college. What will become more important are the skills that you have acquired since that time, as well as your ability to continue acquiring new skills, to continue following the developments in whatever field you are involved in, as well as related fields, and to continue to develop yourself in response to these external events or these external opportunities. So always be on the lookout for continued ways to educate yourself. It doesn't have to even be taking a formal class. It could be reading a book or reading a news article or watching an educational video, whatever you think could improve your skill set, make you a better worker, a more knowledgeable worker. That is what you should do.
Thank you, Honorable Chairman. This is very, very good guideline for the youth communities. But personally, I get chance to develop few corporations, even if it's in Bangladesh, and we develop some of the largest corporations. So when we develop anything based on education, we ensure that when we develop a lot of projects, our students naturally get chances to involve with these projects and they get employment. So that is the one of the way I can remember. Maybe if people can visit, they can understand, because I invite many of my Ivy League friends. They visited Bangladesh and they do works and take some internships, and they understand how big corporations we build. But fact is that we do more focus on entrepreneurship. we are taking a lot of initiative, even when we developing these university projects. Before that, we are taking different kind of smart city projects, manufacturing projects, energy projects, and we are planning that those who develop their knowledge and skills under our umbrella, they can easily get involved inside the corporations. At least we can solve this unemployment problem. Actually, developing nation has to develop many things. Developing nations something different than, let's say, USA or example Europe. I'm sure if European students or American students, they come to Malaysia or Asia Pacific, they get more chances for getting jobs and everything. So as developing nations develop many things, still they are improving in many areas. So we have a chance to solve this problem easily, but we need better team. We need best team. We need good faculty. We need good research. We need to develop, let's say, vaccine. We need to develop our capacity. We need to invest more money on that. So World Talent Economy Forum, we are engaging with our corporation, with our government, and inspire them and motivate them how they can invest more money on research, on educations, and many things. And they have a lot of problem. When they have a lot of problem, so we need a good team, good researcher, and I think Transhumanist can help us to sort out these things. This is really good collaborations, I think. Mr. David Schumacher, you always support our World Talent Economy Forums, and I find that you are very disciplined to support our initiatives. From the beginning, Transhumanist Party actually helped us a lot, and we are very much interested to move forward. So one thing always we are thinking that we do focus on technology, we do focus on industry, we do focus on research and other things. So what about human, and what about the ethical perspective? Because when I have a dream, because my father was a politician, he was a freedom fighter, so I want to engage with like a good political party, those who have an ethical perspective. The more I engage with Transhumanist Party, I'm very happy, and I want to explore these things that you have very ethical standard. But how do we practice more as a better humans in terms of ethics and other things? What are your views on that particular point?
Well, that is clearly a day-to-day issue, isn't it? I mean, for each of us individually as well as collectively. But I think that the Transhumanist Party, and at least those in it that I have been fortunate enough to be able to spend time with and share ideas with, seems to be very, very interested in that. We are all about the ethical use, for example, of new and developing technologies. But it goes beyond that. I think there is a basis for ethics that draws people to the Transhumanist Party. Now, part of what we do in the Transhumanist Party, part of what I do in the Transhumanist Party is engage others that are outside that. I engage my elected representatives here when it's political season and you have people that have stated that they're running for a particular office. I talk to them, I introduce myself, and it goes straight to, what can you do for the people? And it's a talk about ethics in itself. So this is part of a bigger conversation about that I think that can help the youth in Malaysia and in Asia Pacific. Yes, the focus is ethics, and it really needs to be there. That's foundational. It needs to be authentic, but it needs to be carried to as wide an audience as possible. So that's why I carry it out into the political arena, if you will, which isn't necessarily known for ethical behavior. But talking ethics to those people, I think, tends to raise the standard. It tends to raise the level of conversation, and that's something that we can do. It also connects me to people so that when I call them again after having talked to them, they know who I am. Hopefully they have a picture of my background and where I'm coming from, and they're more willing to take my call. But if I was I'm established in my career, but if I was not established in my career, and when I was looking to establish in my career, I used some of these same techniques. So it's not just for ethics and for politics, but it's also for putting myself out there in the workplace. Computers was something that was new when I was developing my career. So I took whatever courses that I could get. A lot of the same advice that I give here, I did back then, and it worked well for me, and I see that as a step forward. But some of the other things that I did besides teaching myself and training myself was to join like a computer club, to join a club of people that were interested in how, at the time, electronics was going to be able to help shape the future of business and how business was done. A lot of these things that we take for granted now were leading edge back then, but there are organizations. So these days, there's something that's called meetup.com, and I don't know if it's worldwide, but I use it here in Arizona, and I've used it in other states, and it gives me an opportunity to plug into different interest groups where I don't know anybody, that I can introduce myself and I can get known in those groups. So somebody that's looking to establish a career, you're going to have people that are going to be at all different levels of their career that will participate in groups. So however you can introduce yourself into these various groups is a good way to get started, because you may be, I used to belong to a group called Data Processing International, I think it was. And I was teaching myself how to code. So I was very rudimentary. But I'm sitting across the table at an event from somebody that's a hiring manager in a coding shop. Now, I never got a job through him, but he introduced me. We talked to a lot of people. I learned his vocabulary. I learned the things that were important to him. And all those things helped shape me as I move forward into my future. So one of the things I like to do when we're talking on the show is to be able to give something that's practical, that you can take away from this conversation and say, I'm going to go try that and see if that works for me. And if it doesn't, try something else. But keep pushing forward. And part of this is connecting. It's self-educating, however you can do that, and then it's connecting you into the places that you want to go. Now, one of the things that was really tough for me, especially when I was younger, is I had a lot of different interests, but I knew where I wanted to go, sort of, at least in a direction professionally. And that meant making some hard choices. It meant spending less time with people that didn't have the same drive and the same motivation and the same direction that I did, and seeking out people that did have that same drive and direction and motivation that I did. And it pays off, because they can introduce you, they can educate you, and they can inform you what this idea is of what you think you want to do. They can tell you what it's actually like if some of these people are actually doing that. So it's education and it's connection both. And hopefully I've given some practical tidbits for how that can be done.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Honorable Chairman, one of the things, like, this is actually right now very important for Muslim communities, even though Middle East, there is a conflict in between Palestine as well as Israel. Your political party, how we can fix this problem?
Yes, and this is perhaps one of the most challenging geopolitical questions in all of human history. And actually, if I had unlimited resources, probably the best fix that I could think of would be to take the entire country of Israel, the land, the cities, the people, airlift it and put it somewhere adjacent to Scandinavia. It's a great country with great people, great high technology infrastructure. It's just situated in an unfortunate place in the world. And I think that would be the best solution to the Middle East crisis. Unfortunately, the crisis is born out of the fact that there are essentially two groups of people, and these groups of people, they're not defined by ethnicity or religion, because in Israel there's also a sizable Arab population. I think about 20% of Israeli citizens are Arabs, and they are participants in the society there and the government there. the Israeli Knesset, which is the parliament of Israel, has Arab members as part of it. So it's not about ethnicity or religion. There are Christians in Israel, there are Muslims in Israel. It's about the mindset toward how a society should be structured. So Israel is a largely secular, largely westernized society with certain principles like the rule of law, like religious toleration, like pluralism. And unfortunately, in places like the Gaza Strip, there are certain organizations that are not receptive toward that. And this is not a problem of Islam, it's a problem of what I would call fundamentalist or militant Islamism. So organizations like Hamas or Islamic Jihad are representative of those trends. And I just don't see how you could have a peaceful, thriving society when you have, on the one hand, an advanced, westernized, technological, secular society, and adjacent to it, militant groups that want to destroy that society. You're going to have conflicts. And in a society which is as densely populated as both Israel is and the Palestinian territories are, unfortunately, civilians are going to bear the brunt of that conflict on both sides. And I would say every death of a civilian, be that person a Palestinian or an Israeli or anyone else, is absolutely tragic. So how does one protect against those kinds of attacks? I think perhaps technology will have the answer, because technology allows defense and offense to be more targeted, more precise. So Israel is already investing in missile interception technology. And I would say the best use of resources in this conflict would be to try to build highly accurate missile interceptions, so that when Hamas launches its makeshift rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces could just shoot them all down and say, well, you tried to attack us, your attack had no effect. And then if for a long, long time their attacks have no effect, whatever they try to do against Israel is going to have no casualties, no property damage, nothing, then eventually perhaps they'll figure out this is futile. It is futile to fight. There should be better ways. And ultimately, I think in every society, if you advance technologically, if you advance in terms of material standards of living, if people have economic opportunity, if they have education, if they have access to many different kinds of people, many different worldviews, and they're able to consider them and compare them and choose for themselves what they want to adopt, then the incentive for war, the incentive for killing other people, goes away. And I think in this conflict, unfortunately, one side has advanced far enough that probably if you ask most Israeli citizens, they have no reason to go to war against any Muslim country. The only way they would go to war is if they see a threat to their own homeland as they perceive it and their own citizens. So how do you bring up the Palestinian territories to a similar level of development? How do you give the Palestinian citizens the same kind of understanding that it's more advantageous to trade with people, to exchange ideas with people, to learn from people rather than kill them? And that's a very challenging type of situation to resolve. It probably cannot be resolved overnight because the entire country of Israel can't be airlifted to a safer location. But I think this is the goal that needs to be worked towards, so that the people living in such close proximity have similar standards of living and access to technology, and then the conflict will dissipate on its own.
But Honorable Chairman, in 1917, there is a Balfour declarations in between UK and Israeli communities, and based on this declaration, they are trying to develop these things. And Masjid al-Aqsa actually important for all of the religious, let's say for Jewish, for Christian, for Muslim. This is very important. Uh, like at present conditions, your one strategy I really like we have to, both of the Israel is a developed nation, so Palestinian need to be developed, and we have to invest on more education, more developments. So what do you think? Is it the political problem because of Balfour declarations? It happens, and then there is a lot of political turmoils. Even it's not good for Muslim development, even though the Israeli developments. So what do you think? It's more on I want to explain in that way. It's a political problem, or what the most of the other people are like Israeli or Palestinian, they do not think about them. They just want to think about their political empowerments and continuing this kind of problem, which will help them to create. They want to be more powerful. That is the thing. What do you think? Is it political issues, or the only for the betterment of the humans and their own community?
Well, I think political issues certainly played a role in precipitating the current crisis and the many crises that preceded it. And one can fault British foreign policy in the early part of the 20th century for some of the conditions that led to subsequent crises, but ultimately the Balfour Declaration took place more than a century ago now. And at a certain point in time, irrespective of what suboptimal decisions may have been made in the past, people had many opportunities from that point forward to decide one way or another way. And certainly, if it were just one bad decision that were made previously, we wouldn't have this persistent crisis. This persistent crisis occurs because there are cycles of bad decisions that continue and that feed on one another. And it's not that one side is completely blameless and the other side is completely guilty. Throughout the history of that region, there have been atrocities committed on all sides. And one noteworthy observation that I will make is there had been Jewish terrorist groups in the early part of the 20th century, leading up to the formation of Israel. But one has to ask, why were there Jewish terrorist groups alongside Arabic terrorist groups as well? Because at that point in time, the Jewish settlers lived in conditions that were similarly miserable to how a lot of Palestinians unfortunately live today. And when people live in these conditions of scarcity, of poverty, of perceived vulnerability, they are willing often to take desperate measures, and they feel like they have less to lose from engaging in acts of violence. But as Israel became a more established and more prosperous country, we ceased having Jewish terrorist groups in that region. So that leads me to believe that economic and technological and educational development are absolutely essential to transforming that region. And I just hope to see the Palestinian territories taking a similar path. I think that would be the most effective way to de-escalate that conflict. Now, in the meantime, unfortunately, there are organizations like Hamas and Islamic Jihad that don't want that path to be taken, because if they engage in these acts of violence and they benefit from them, why would they want anything to change? So the Palestinians need leaders who are willing to take them on that path of development as well.
This is very important, that they have to move with this modern science, education, and technology, and this will help them to the next level. But what do you think? Let's say I live in one place last 60 years, 70 years, 100 years, and suddenly I find that I am no more for this land. My own land is not my land. Do you think it's actually create lot more imbalancing situations, or because Malaysia Muslims, their local community, we are very concerned to solve this problem, but definitely we want peaceful solutions. We want some, because you are highly educated, like a group of people do Transhumanist Party. So what do you think? Like, if my land after 60-70 years I find I'm no more, actually not this problem not starting from this rockets launching from the Hamas. It's starting from few family members. They are actually like they have to move from their own land after 70 years. This problem actually start in that way. So
Right.
yeah, it's not when Hamas come after a lot of incidents, when Muslims go to the Masjid al-Aqsa and they are beaten by the police. Then this, after that day, actually we, yes, definitely what Hamas do, we are not supporting that. Why they launching rocket, we never support that. But fact is, there are, beside these Hamas issues and other things, there are other things happening. This is important. And what do things like, when I do not have options, live independently, or I face a lot of challenging situation. This is very common. I move with a terrorist group of peoples, because how the Hamas getting their soldier? Definitely from their Palestinian own people. This is critical. I believe this is critical, but I believe that this is the solution only we have, education. If we provide proper education, proper support, we should not invest on Hamas or any kind of terrorist things. We should invest on education. Even that is the objective of World Talent Economy Forum. What's your view? Yes.
Yes, I agree with you absolutely that education is crucial. I also think that a forward-looking outlook is important for people who may indeed have been affected by injustice in the past. And you mention certain episodes in the history of that region where, again, during the early part of the 20th century, some of the Palestinians who lived in that area may have lost their land, in particular if they were renting that land and their landlords were actually Ottoman Turks. And then the Jewish settlers came in and they purchased that land from the owners, and the Ottoman Turks sold them the land, but then the Jewish settlers, they had other purposes for that land, so they told the Palestinian tenants essentially, your services are no longer needed, and the tenants had to move. So that's how it happened, and it was unfortunate. It was legal given the framework of that time, but I recognize it would have been hard for those people. However, I do think after the passage of many years and many generations, it is important to say, yes, this happened. This was a part of history. It wasn't ideal. But what can I do now, given the situation that I find myself in? And it may also not be a good situation, because many people in that part of the world, unfortunately, are not prospering right now. But still, there are many opportunities. And perhaps some of your listeners do come from the Palestinian territories. My recommendation to them would be to move in directions that take them as far away from that conflict as possible. So don't just think in terms of what can you do in Palestine. Think in terms of what can you do in the world? What options do you have? Not even, say, in the Western world, but elsewhere in the Muslim world, there are many opportunities. For instance, in the United Arab Emirates or in the Asia Pacific region, there are prospering economies that are seeking talented workers. And I think the advice that I gave for people to educate themselves applies on an individual level too. And I would say a lot of Palestinians have done exceptionally well by moving to the Western world as well. In the United States, I've met many Palestinian immigrants, and they have been able to thrive irrespective of any hardships that their ancestors have faced. I think that's a pathway that is not necessarily easy for people. It certainly has its own challenges, its own obstacles, but it's a much better pathway than continuing to be embroiled in this generation's old conflict. Because if one side visited an injustice on the other side, and then the other side retaliated, and then the first side retaliated, and this continued on for generations, if a given individual from the present vantage point inserts himself into that conflict, well, what can that person really do except to just become part of the cycle? I think the way to solve those kinds of conflicts is to change the entire set of conditions in which those conflicts take place. So imagine if enough Palestinians follow my advice and educate themselves, seek out opportunities outside of that region, and then there comes about a substantial Palestinian diaspora. And these will be people with skills, with resources, with an interest in helping the people who were left behind in that region. And I think they could change the situation within that conflict. And people might no longer see Hamas or Islamic Jihad as being that attractive if the Palestinian diaspora offers them much better options.
Thank you. This is the first time you are. I feel you are giving a very good strategy for the Middle East. I think the audience, those who are observing our show, share as much as possible. I think this is the solution. You have to educate it yourself. You have to take the global opportunities, and you have to work for your country peacefully, not in a violent way. Mr. David, what your guideline? What your advice?
Wow, that was a very great explanation. It was great because it was accurate, it was to the point, and it provided something practical. And I will go out on a limb here and speak for Gennady and say that he practiced what he preaches, because the U.S. and Nevada is not where he started out in life either. So he went and developed himself and moved to where his education, where his training, where his drive would take him. On a lesser scale, I did the same thing. My family that I grew up in was not wealthy, was not even perhaps of equal means with a lot of other Americans. And I left my home state. In my particular case, I joined the military, where I anticipated spending about 4 years where they would teach me a trade and then give me an opportunity for some college money. And then I was going to go back home to my state of Oregon, where I had grown up. But I've never been back, because with that education, with that opportunity, I've moved around. I've lived in a large number of US states, and I've been fortunate also to have lived and traveled overseas, and all of that has been very broadening. And I too can say, from my perspective, do what you can to improve your own situation, because then you can turn around and you can help the people around you once you've done that. And until then, you're not adding to the solution. You are at worst contributing to the problem, or at least you're swimming in the problem. So yes, great. Thank you for that lesson, Gennady. I appreciate it, I think, as much as anybody else listening.
Excellent. We need more politicians like this, those who can guide us. I think even the more talented people like Mr. Gennady will join in the politics, we get better strategy, we get better policy, and we get better solutions. But we are very unlucky now, even in the developing nations, specifically, I believe that there are no like highly talented people in the politics. They love to do more job in multinational companies, or they want to develop their own business. So thank you, Mr. Gennady, actually, for the sacrificing. Even Mr. David Schumacher, your sacrifice for the political point of view. This is actually hope for the world. This is the way we can think positively, because ultimately politician has their power to solve many problems, but we need good people in the politics. I think that is the major problem right now. We have our summit next week, same times, Futuristic Leadership Summit. And as there is a timetable issue, that's why we want to arrange it the same time in next Saturday. So I want to invite Mr. Kennedy and Mr. David and different like your political people to join in the summit. We will explore it as much as possible, and hopefully we will learn more interesting things from your speech. And if you want to do a presentations, let's say 10-minute presentation, 2-minute question answer, so we will wait for your presentation. I'm sure our community, our youth communities, our political parties, our policymakers, universities, corporations, they will learn a lot from your guidelines. Now the final question I have, I want to ask you what your advice for global peace and human development, Mr. Kennedy. Yes.
Yes, and this is a fitting question given what we just discussed in terms of how do we achieve peace more generally, because it is important to note the frequency of large-scale conflicts has decreased significantly since the conclusion of the Second World War. And I think it is important to ask why that has happened. There has been a lot of scholarship written. One of the best books that I'm aware of is a book by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And this book chronicles the general trend toward a decline in violence throughout human history. And Pinker identifies several factors that are responsible for that trend. One of the key factors is increasing prosperity. But another key factor is a philosophical one, the rise of the ideas of the Age of Enlightenment, the ideas of cosmopolitanism, of toleration, of being willing to accept the differences among people, whether they be cultural differences, religious differences, intellectual differences. The idea is we have more to gain from peaceful exchange with one another, from sharing ideas, from engaging in commerce than we do from conflict, from taking resources. And also, the more comfortable we are, the more prosperous we are, the less of an incentive we have to risk it all in bloody and dangerous and uncertain conflict. One of the great tragedies of war is not just the loss of life, which is the worst tragedy, but also the destruction of infrastructure, of buildings, of productive capacity. And so even the winners in a war get to lead poorer lives afterward. And today, with so many opportunities for economic exchange across borders, it just makes no sense to fight a war. There are better ways to resolve differences and settle conflicts. So I think a change in mindset combined with a more rapid diffusion of technological advancement and economic infrastructure throughout the world will lead us to the point where there will be fewer and fewer conflicts until eventually war itself becomes obsolete. I think if the Transhumanist Party has an ability to implement its platform, sometime during this century, all war will end. And I am serious about this. There is possibly going to be some time in the 21st century when humans from throughout the world will be able to take notice and say, there are no more armed conflicts being fought anywhere in the world. And perhaps at that point, there can be a universal treaty on the abolition of war signed by all of the nations of the world. If we are fortunate, we are a few decades away from this. And I hope that the US Transhumanist Party is successful in implementing its platform and inspiring other transhumanist parties and other transhumanist organizations throughout the world to do the same. Because through technological progress, through economic development, through improving the human being, we can overcome what has been one of the most wasteful and most destructive activities throughout our history.
Perhaps we lost Sharif.
Well, I think we are still live. So I would say, David, do you have any thoughts on how humankind can achieve global peace? Would you agree with me that that's a realistic goal if the other transhumanist goals, such as overcoming biological aging or overcoming material scarcity, are achieved?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And, that is the benefit and why I'm involved with the Transhumanist Party. And I want to just add one thing to what you were saying. I think that education is the foundation for this, because education helps provide, I think, understanding outside of the limited knowledge base of what you grow up around and what people that you know can tell you. You can be open to a wider area, and that goes to connection. So as you are pursuing an education in the STEM areas, I would also say that you need to pursue education in humanities as well for balance. And while we're learning to use the rational tools that you brought out that are evident from the Enlightenment, and also the humanities, I think, help us make that connection to the things that are hard to perhaps rationally describe, that help make us human as well, and also helps us to connect to people of different experience. If I go to an art gallery, I may talk with people of many different cultures as we're looking at, say, a painting, and we can both feel the same things and we can see some of the same things, and that creates a sense of connection. So that connection, along with the practical education, helps, and that connection then helps form a basis for stability. And the more stable an area is, you touched on this, brings in investment into that area. People will not spend money for infrastructure of any type if there isn't stability. So education, connection can then go about bring stability, can bring investment, and with investment tied back to those things that I previously mentioned, it's inevitable that prosperity grows out of that. And prosperity is one of the greatest things for peace, because if I'm prosperous and I have a lot to lose, and you're prosperous and you have a lot to lose, I am much less liable to pick a fight with you or you with me that can destroy some of our prosperity. So it is one of those situations that builds on itself, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy for creating the peace that we want. So live long and prosper.
Yes, live long and prosper.
Thank you. I'm sorry for some sort of technical problem, but it's a really, really great session. I learned a lot from these sessions, and I want to say politicians should be like that. Politics for betterment. It's not for just for money, for power and everything. We need to develop more good strategy for the global communities. So I request everyone, especially the youth communities, those who have more interest on science, engineering and technology, you can join in Transhumanist Party. Transhumanist Party has their core values, and with their core value they can solve many things. I'm very much hopeful with their political movement, and definitely with our collaboration, World Talent Economy Forums and Transhumanist Party, we can bring more good opportunities for global communities. This is our 284 episode. Already we engage with 100 different countries, 300 different corporations around the world, and hopefully we can solve millions of people problem. From my personal experience, I saw millions of people actually untouched the modern science, modern engineering, modern technology. They cannot touch the human lives. And what actually Honorable Chairman said, that we need to develop better educations, we need to develop better technologies, and we have to think peacefully how we can solve these things. This is the ultimately way of improvement. So thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. Hopefully, with your collaborations, we can run a long way and we can touch millions of lives. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, and thank you, Mr. David Schumacher. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session. And share our content as much as possible. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you. Bye-bye.